The morning came to northern Montana the way it always did in February, sharp, clean, and unapologetic. Frost clung to the pine needles like tiny glass beads catching the early sun and turning the forest into something that looked almost holy. The air had that particular bite to it, the kind that made a man's lungs feel scrubbed out and new even if the rest of him felt old and worn down. Dalton Stone Mercer ran the trail the way some men said their prayers. Not because he expected answers, but because the rhythm kept the noise in his head from getting too loud. He was 52 years old and built like a man who'd been paid to endure things most people only saw in nightmares. 6'1" broad, through the shoulders, dense through the chest and back. The kind of strength that didn't announce itself. It just was. His face carried the map of everywhere he'd been, sharp bones under weathered skin, a jaw shadowed by stubble that never quite grew into a full beard anymore, gray-blue eyes set deep under a brow that looked permanently fixed against glare. Half habit, half history. His skin had that sun-brown tone that came from living in harsh light for too long, from places where the sun didn't forgive and the sand got into everything. His hair was clipped short in the no-nonsense style he'd worn for 25 years. Dark brown shot through with silver at the temples that made him look older when the light hit it right. He kept it that way because it was practical, because the wind couldn't grab it, because practicality was easier than explaining anything else. He wore the same outfit he wore for most things now. An olive field jacket broken in at the elbows with pockets that still held a compass he didn't need and a lighter he didn't use. Dark green cargo pants that had seen better days. A red and navy plaid flannel shirt under the jacket, the kind loggers wore, the kind that didn't pretend to be anything other than functional. Scuffed brown leather boots that had walked more miles than he cared to count. A battered military watch clung to his wrist like an old memory refusing to let go. A pocket knife rested in his right pocket, the weight of it familiar and grounding. On his back sat an old military pack, not because he needed it for a morning run, but because he liked the weight, liked the feeling of being prepared for a world that rarely gave warnings. Beside him moved Valor. The German shepherd was 7 years old and still carried himself like he was on duty. Black saddle across his back, tan legs and chest, a thick, short coat that shone healthy in the cold morning light. He wasn't bulky, he was efficient. Muscle laid over bone like a well-built machine meant to turn fast and stop faster. His ears stayed upright, constantly sampling the world for information most creatures missed. His eyes were dark and intelligent, not the soft gaze of a house pet, but the focused stare of an animal that never stopped reading the environment. Valor ran without waste, no needless lunges, no playful zigzags. He matched Dalton's pace like a shadow with a heartbeat, like the two of them were connected by something stronger than a leash. Dalton liked that about him. It made the silence feel shared instead of lonely. They followed the trail as it cut through the pines, the path packed down by hikers and deer, and the occasional ATV that ignored the rules. Sunlight filtered through the needles and turned the air into floating dust of gold. Dalton's body knew the run. His mind tried to drift away from anything sharp, anything that cut. Then Valor stopped. Not gradually, not with hesitation. One stride, then stillness, as if someone had pressed a pause button on the entire world. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stared into the trees to the left of the trail, fixed on a space between two ancient pines that looked empty to Dalton's eyes. Valor's posture changed in a way Dalton recognized instantly, in a place under his ribs where 20 years of training still lived. Alert, silent, ready. The dog's breathing stayed controlled, but the fur along his shoulders lifted a fraction, as if the cold itself had reached out and touched him with invisible fingers. Dalton slowed, his boots scuffed on gravel and frozen dirt. Seriously? He muttered, trying for humor he didn't quite feel. If it's another porcupine, you're negotiating that relationship on your own. Valor didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't acknowledge the words at all. Dalton felt irritation, first the mild, tired kind, that came from wanting peace and finding complications instead. He'd come out here for quiet, for a clean head, for a morning that didn't carry ghosts. But the irritation slid into something else when Valor's gaze didn't waver. The forest suddenly seemed to hold its breath. The wind stopped moving through the branches. Even the distant sound of the lake seemed to fade, like the world had turned down its volume to listen. Dalton's hand tightened on the leash. He didn't pull Valor away because pulling never worked on that kind of focus. If Valor decided the world needed attention, the world usually did. "All right," Dalton said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "Show me." Valor moved without permission, not yanking wildly, but guiding with purpose. Pulling like a compass needle dragged by a magnetic truth it couldn't ignore. They left the trail, stepping over fallen branches, crusted with frost, navigating around moss-covered rocks that looked older than memory. Pine needles cushioned their footsteps, muffling the sound until it felt like they were walking through a cathedral made of wood and silence. The farther they went, the more the air seemed to change. It wasn't colder exactly, it was older. A scent threaded through the pine, faint but unmistakable to Dalton's trained nose. Rust, old oil, something metallic and patient, like the smell of abandoned machinery slowly giving itself back to the earth. Valor's nose dipped low, tracking it. His body language shifted into something Dalton had seen 100 times before in deserts and mountains, in places where the ground held secrets it didn't want to give up. Dalton felt the hair on his arms lift. Not from fear exactly, but from recognition without context. From the feeling that whatever waited ahead had been waiting a long time. They broke through a tangle of young saplings' branches scraping against Dalton's jacket and saw it. A semi-tractor. An old one, rusted, impatient, and half swallowed by the forest floor. It lay tilted at an angle as if the earth had softened just enough to receive it and then hardened again, holding it in place. The metal skin had blistered into orange-brown scabs of rust that looked like the vehicle was slowly turning into soil. Vines and roots wrapped around the chassis like patient hands, like the forest had decided this thing belonged to it now and would never let it roll again. The cab was tilted slightly to one side. The windshield had fractured into a spiderweb pattern that caught the morning sunlight in sharp, bright lines, turning the glass into something that looked almost beautiful in its brokenness. And then Dalton noticed the tree. A thick pine trunk rose beside the cab, pressed so close that the truck's frame seemed to have merged with it. The boundary between steel and wood felt blurred, impossible to separate. Roots curled around the wheels like fingers, like the forest was holding this secret close to its chest and had no intention of sharing it with the world above. The truck didn't look abandoned. It looked imprisoned. Dalton took a slow breath. He could hear his own pulse in his ears, steady and insistent. He could also hear a softer sound, the whisper of wind moving through the cab, pushing vines, making them shift in small rhythmic motions that looked almost like breathing. A warm amber glow flickered inside the cabin. Not a headlight, not anything powered by a battery that should have died decades ago. This was softer, gentler, like a pocket of fireflies trapped behind glass, or a smear of bioluminescent life clinging to surfaces that stayed damp and dark. The glow brightened and dimmed with the wind's movement through the vines, making it look disturbingly alive, making it look like the truck itself was breathing. Dalton stared at it, his mouth dry, his throat tight. "That's not," he began, then stopped because saying it out loud would make it real in a way he wasn't ready for. Valor approached the truck and stopped at the step beneath the driver's door. He didn't paw at it. He didn't whine. He simply looked up at the cab, waiting as if he expected someone to open the door from the inside. Dalton's throat tightened. In the sunlit quiet, the truck felt less like a piece of abandoned machinery and more like a story that had never been finished. A sentence cut off mid-word, waiting for someone to come back and complete it. He stepped closer. The smell of rust and old oil thickened, braided with pine sap and earth and time. He placed a hand on the cab's doorframe. The metal was cold, rough, flaking beneath his fingers like old skin. His brain offered him the sensible thought. This is evidence. This is someone's missing vehicle. This is not your problem. But another thought rose behind it, quieter but heavier. If Valor found it, it's already your problem. He climbed onto the step. It creaked but held his weight. And that was when the memory bit him. Not as a clear picture, more like a flash of sensation. Salt air mixed with diesel fumes. The hiss of a radio struggling against interference. A voice that might have been a man, might have been static, might have been both calling out a name Dalton hadn't heard in 27 years. A command in someone else's tone, flat and final. Ignore it, Stone. It's thermal noise from the Serbian front. Not our problem. Dalton had obeyed because obedience was how you stayed alive, how you kept others alive. But the feeling that followed the cold, sinking certainty that noise sometimes had a name had never really left him. It had just learned to live in the spaces between his breaths, waiting for moments like this. Dalton swallowed hard as if the air had turned to sand in his throat. He leaned into the cab. The interior was a ruin. Seat foam had torn apart, exposing the skeleton of springs underneath. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed by anything except time. A small colony of moss clung to the edge of the dash where rainwater must have seeped in over the years, patient and persistent. The amber glow wasn't coming from a bulb. It came from life. Tiny points of light nestled in damp corners, bioluminescent fungi, or insects shimmering faintly like fallen stars that refused to go out. Nature's way of making light in the dark. Dalton's gaze drifted to the steering wheel, and then his heart stopped. Scratched into the worn rubber, carved hard and deliberate with something sharp, was a message. "Stone, if you're here, you're late." The words hit him like a fist to the chest. Not the sentence itself, but the name. The nickname. The certainty that whoever had carved those letters knew exactly who would find them. Dalton's breath caught in his lungs. The sentence felt less like a note and more like a verdict, like an accusation that had been waiting 27 years to be read. He stared at it until the words blurred, until his eyes burned with something that wasn't from the cold. Then something fell. A small metal object slipped from a crack near the dashboard and clinked against the floorboard with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cab. Valor's head snapped toward the sound, ears forward, eyes sharp. The dog's focus wasn't curiosity, it was recognition. Dalton crouched carefully, his knees protesting, and picked up the object. It was a military dog tag, dented and weathered edges, dulled by time and moisture, but the name stamped into it was still readable. Elijah Ross, handler. The name meant nothing to Dalton's conscious mind, and everything to the part of him that had learned to lock doors he never dared open. Elijah Ross, Kosovo, 1999. The mission that never made it into any official report. The name landed in Dalton's chest like a familiar weight, like a stone he'd been carrying for so long. He'd forgotten it was there until someone reminded him it had never stopped being heavy. He held the tag between his fingers, feeling the chill of metal seep into his skin, feeling the raised letters under his thumb. Valor stepped closer and sniffed it. Then unexpectedly, the dog did something Dalton had rarely seen him do. Valor pressed his nose gently to the tag and exhaled a long, slow breath. Not a sniff, not an investigation. A greeting, as if he were saying hello to someone who'd been gone a very long time. Dalton's pulse hammered, his hands shook. And right then, right when his mind tried to stitch together the impossible, Valor sat down. Not a casual sit, not a relaxed waiting posture. This was the sit Dalton remembered from training grounds and midnight operations, in moments when everything depended on absolute discipline. The silent alert, the freeze that meant danger or target or do not move unless you want to die. Valor's eyes remained locked on the cab's darkness past Dalton, as if something stood there in the shadows where the amber light couldn't reach. But Dalton saw nothing. He felt something, though, a pressure behind his ribs, the sense of being watched, not by an animal, not by a person, by consequence, by the weight of choices made and not made, by words spoken and not spoken, by signals heard and ignored. He looked at the tag again, turned it over in his palm. On the back, faint but visible, were scratched coordinates. Numbers that meant something once. Numbers that probably still did. Elijah Ross, Dalton whispered, his voice rough and broken. The name felt foreign in his mouth, like a language he used to speak but had forgotten. The wind shifted. The glow in the cab flickered, brightened for one breath, then dimmed again like a pulse, like a heartbeat from something that should have stopped beating a long time ago. And Dalton heard himself speak, not to Valor, not to the forest, but to the part of his past that had never stopped walking behind him, patient and relentless. "No," he murmured, "that can't be. The sentence cracked before it finished, because the carved message stared back at him from the wheel like an accusation that didn't need a witness, like a truth that had carved itself into the world and refused to fade. "Stone, if you're here, you're late." Valor didn't move, didn't blink, only watched the darkness inside the cab with the patience of an animal that had learned to wait for things humans couldn't see. And Dalton, standing on the step of a truck the force had swallowed, holding a name he'd tried not to remember but had never actually forgotten, realized with cold certainty that this morning run had never been about exercise at all. It had been a summons. He swallowed the rest of the sentence, the one that wanted to say dead, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any word. Valor sat like a statue carved from loyalty and warning. Dalton stared into the cab's dim breathing light and whispered again, softer this time, as if speaking too loudly might wake the wrong thing. "Impossible." Then he went quiet. Because in Valor's stillness, in the weight of the bond tag in his palm, in the message carved into rubber by hands that had been steady and certain, the world had already answered. Dalton didn't run back to the trail. He walked slow and deliberate, like a man carrying something fragile that could shatter if he moved too fast. Like a man who just picked up a weight he'd put down 27 years ago and discovered it hadn't gotten any lighter. Valor stayed close at his left knee, not pulling now, not urging. The dog's body had shifted into steady working calm, as if the forest had handed him a message, and he was waiting for Dalton to decide what to do with it. The metal dog tag felt heavier in Dalton's pocket than it had any right to. Names did that sometimes. They became weights. They became anchors. They became ghosts with paperwork. By the time they reached the trail again, Dalton's breath had settled, but his mind hadn't. The lake flashed through the trees like nothing in the world had changed. Sunlight still fell in clean stripes across the dirt path. Somewhere a bird called bright and ordinary, oblivious to the fact that the ground had just shifted under a man's feet. It made Dalton angry in a way he couldn't fully explain. The world's refusal to acknowledge that something had changed, that something buried had just clawed its way to the surface. He checked his watch out of habit. The second hand swept smoothly around the face, indifferent to human drama. It was 8:43 in the morning, Tuesday, February 11th, 2026. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen for a long moment before his thumb moved. He didn't like involving anyone. He'd spent years being trained to solve problems with the smallest footprint possible. But this wasn't a problem that ended with a single decision. This was a problem that multiplied. When the dispatcher answered, Dalton kept his voice even the way he'd been taught. Calm was a weapon. Panic was a liability. "There's a semi-tractor off the North Ridge Trail," he said. "Old. Looks like it's been there a long time. Could be tied to a missing vehicle. I'm not touching anything else." A pause, keys clicking. "Can you give me a location, sir?" Dalton described landmarks the way he'd once described shorelines in the dark. Precise, unemotional, practiced. Grid coordinates if they mattered, visual markers if they didn't. The lightning struck pine. The boulder shaped like a broken tooth. The place where the trail forked and one path led to water and the other led to nothing. He ended the call and stood there listening to the wind move through the pine needles, listening to his own breathing, listening to Valor's steady presence beside him. The dog looked up at him, eyes steady, as if to say, "Good." Dalton didn't know why that look bothered him more than fear ever could. Maybe because it felt like approval for stepping into something he should have stepped into 27 years ago. Maybe because it felt like forgiveness he didn't deserve. He knelt down and ran his hand over Valor's head, feeling the warm, solid reality of the animal. "You found something, didn't you?" he said quietly. "Something that's been waiting." Valor leaned into the touch just slightly, just enough to say he understood. 25 minutes later, Dalton heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A county sheriff's SUV appeared on the Forest Service road, bouncing slightly on the uneven ground. It stopped in a cloud of dust and winter sunlight. Deputy Owen Nash climbed out. Owen was in his late 40s, tall but not imposing. He had a lean build that suggested he'd once been athletic and had slowly traded workouts for coffee and paperwork, and the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying things you couldn't put down. His face was narrow, his cheekbones pronounced, and his jaw carried stubble that wasn't fashioned so much as fatigue. His eyes were a tired hazel soft until they weren't. The kind of eyes that had seen too much and learned to look away just enough to survive. He wore a sheriff's department jacket unzipped over a plain shirt, and his movements had the cautious economy of someone who'd learned long ago not to waste energy on drama. He nodded at Dalton like they'd spoken 100 times, even though they hadn't. "Mercer," Owen said, his voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who'd grown up within 50 miles of where they still lived. "You all right?" Dalton gave a small shrug. "Found something weird." Owen's gaze flicked to Valor. His expression changed, just a shade, barely visible, like a man recognizing a tool and the kind of trouble that tool often invited. "K9?" Owen asked. "Retired," Dalton answered. Owen exhaled as if that was both relief and not, as if a retired military dog was somehow better than an active one, but still carried implications he didn't want to think about too hard. A second vehicle arrived behind him, marked with a Forest Service emblem. The door opened and a woman stepped out, shutting it with the kind of authority that said she didn't ask permission for much. Ranger Sarah Whitmore looked like she belonged to the landscape in the same way granite belonged to mountains. Solid, weathered, not interested in excuses. She was mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and short gray hair tucked under a dark green cap with the Forest Service logo. Her uniform was practical, heavy jacket, thick pants. Boots meant for mud and ice and miles of walking. A radio clipped at her shoulder, crackling softly with distant voices. When she walked, she didn't tiptoe around branches. The branches moved for her. Sarah's eyes swept Dalton, then Valor, then the tree line beyond, always scanning, always cataloging. "Who called it in?" she asked, voice firm and direct. "I did," Dalton said. Sarah's gaze landed on Valor, then back to Dalton. Something shifted in her expression, not suspicion exactly, more like professional interest mixed with caution. "Your dog lead you to it?" she asked. Dalton hesitated. The truth felt complicated. He stopped. I followed. Sarah's mouth tightened, not in disbelief, but in that familiar professional way of filing something away for later, for when it might matter. All right, here's how we do this. No one touches anything. We treat it like a crime scene until we can prove it isn't. Owen nodded. Sarah's right. Dalton swallowed the urge to say he already knew that he'd stood in enough places where evidence mattered to understand the rules. I didn't move anything, he said instead. Just looked. Good, Sarah said, and started walking. Dalton followed, Valor at heel. Owen came behind them, hand resting near his belt, not threatening, just ready. The way men moved when they weren't sure what they were walking into, but knew it might not be friendly. As they neared the clearing, Sarah slowed. Her eyes tracked the ground, the plants, the patterns of disturbance. She crouched near the edge where the underbrush thinned. Tracks, she murmured, fingers hovering over a faint depression in the partially frozen soil. Old, mostly deer and small game. Her finger moved to another mark. And somebody's been here before. Not recent, but not ancient either. Owen's shoulders tightened. That's not good. Dalton stood still, letting them work. He felt oddly like he was back in training, watching instructors read terrain, like it was a language with grammar and syntax and rules. He hated how familiar it felt, hated how his body liked it, how it remembered the rhythm of observation and analysis, and the quiet satisfaction of piecing together what happened from what got left behind. Sarah rose and looked at the truck for a long moment. Her expression didn't change, but Dalton saw her jaw tighten. This isn't an everyday find, she said quietly. Owen stared at the cab, then down at his own boots. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, like he didn't want the forest to hear. This vehicle, he said carefully, might be in a file. Dalton's stomach tightened. A file? Owen nodded, once reluctant. A missing vehicle report. Old. Sarah's eyes narrowed. If it's old, why is it still sitting out here? Owen's jaw worked like he was chewing something he didn't want to swallow. Because it was closed. Dalton blinked. Closed. How? Owen met his eyes and Dalton saw something there. Fear, maybe. Or shame. Or both braided together into something that had lived in the man for a long time. Hush, closed, Owen said quietly. Not, we found it closed. More like, stop asking, closed. Sarah's stare hardened. You're telling me somebody ordered a missing vehicle file shut without recovery? Owen didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Dalton felt the dog tag in his pocket like a hot coin. Like it was burning through fabric and skin, trying to brand itself onto him as proof that some things refuse to stay buried no matter how deep you put them. Sarah lifted her radio and spoke into it, calm and clipped. Dispatch, this is Whitmore. I need a trail cam check along North Ridge and the Service Road junction. Also confirm if any cams were flagged in this area for tampering in the last year. Static crackled. Then a voice acknowledging. Owen's eyes flicked to Dalton's pack. You carrying anything out here you shouldn't? Dalton didn't flinch. Water, first aid, normal gear. Sarah cut in without looking at Owen. He's fine. Owen's gaze shifted to Valor again. The dog's eyes angled toward the deputy, measuring him the way dogs measured everything by scent and posture, and the 1,000 tiny signals humans broadcast without knowing. Your dog, Owen said. What's his name? Valor. He's tuned, Owen observed, and there was something almost like respect in his voice. That's the point, Dalton said. Sarah approached the truck's rear, studying the ground beside the wheels where roots had grown thick and possessive. Roots have it locked pretty good, she noted. But if we document first, we can bring in equipment later. Dalton nodded, then felt Valor's leash tighten just slightly. The dog's nose dropped to the ground and he started moving along the truck's side. Slow, methodical, not frantic, not playful. Working, Sarah noticed instantly. What's he doing? Dalton followed the dog's line. Tracking. Tracking what? Owen asked, his hand moving closer to his belt. Dalton didn't answer because he didn't know. But he trusted Valor's nose more than he trusted most things in this world. Valor stopped behind the cab and began pawing at one specific patch of earth. Careful, controlled. Like he was uncovering something precious. He didn't dig wildly. He scraped, paused, scraped, again letting his nose guide him. Sarah's posture changed. Alert, suspicious. All right, that's enough, she said, stepping closer. We don't disturb ground near evidence. Dalton held up a hand. He's not tearing it up. He's showing. Sarah's eyes narrowed at Dalton, then at Valor. Dogs don't show, they react. This one shows, Dalton said quietly with the certainty of a man who'd watched this animal work for years. Owen moved in voice gentler than Sarah's. Mercer, we have procedures. I know you're trying to do the right thing, but if we mess up the scene, Dalton felt a flare of heat behind his ribs. Procedure. That word again. Procedure was what you hid behind when you couldn't admit you were afraid. He opened his mouth to snap back. Then Valor froze. Not the earlier set, not the alert posture. A full body stillness. Nose hovering inches above the dirt. His ears were forward. His eyes were locked on the exact place he'd been scraping. The air felt suddenly thick. And Dalton, without knowing why, whispered, "What do you smell, boy?" Valor didn't look at him, didn't need to. The answer was in the ground. Sarah exhaled impatience and curiosity wrestling in her expression. Finally, she said, "Fine. Minimal disturbance. Mercer, you do it. Slow." Dalton crouched, heart thudding against his ribs. He pulled on a pair of gloves from his pack the way a man puts on armor when he knows he's about to touch something that can change him. He scraped the soil carefully, using the flat of his knife handle like a tool instead of a weapon. Dark dirt gave way to damp clay, then to something hard. Metal and fabric. He eased it free and lifted it into the light. A dog collar, black nylon stiff with age. The buckle corroded, the fabric stained by time and weather and burial. But on a small engraved plate, worn but still readable, were letters that made the world tilt sideways. E. Ross, handler. Sarah leaned in. Owen's breath caught audibly. "That's K9 issued," Sarah said, her voice losing some of its professional edge. Owen stared at the plate like it was a live wire. "We need to log this, photograph it, bag it." Dalton held the collar carefully as if it might crumble into dust in his hands, as if the weight of 27 years might be too much for old fabric to bear. Valor sniffed once, then pressed his nose to it. Gentle, reverent, the way you touch something holy. Sarah watched that, and for the first time her hard expression softened by a fraction. "He recognizes it," she said quietly. Dalton didn't answer because the truth was stranger than recognition. Valor didn't look like he recognized an object. He looked like he recognized a person. Like the scent carried a memory that went deeper than leather and nylon. Like somewhere in this dog's history, this collar had meant something more than equipment. And Dalton wondered, not for the first time, what stories lived in the silence between a handler and their dog. What promises got made that couldn't be spoken. What debts got carried across years and miles, and the spaces between life and whatever came after. He looked at the collar in his hands, at the name engraved in metal, at Valor's steady brown eyes watching him with something that looked uncomfortably like expectation. And he understood, with the slow, terrible clarity of a man who'd been running from the truth for 27 years, that this morning had changed everything. That the signal he'd ignored in 1999 hadn't died. It had just been waiting. Waiting for the right dog to find the right man in the right forest at the right moment when running was no longer an option. "Elijah Ross," Dalton said again, tasting the name, letting it settle into the cold morning air like a promise he was finally ready to keep. And the forest patient and ancient and unforgiving seemed to listen. A new vehicle arrived not long after moving too carefully down the Forest Service road. The engine sound was different from the rough, practical rumble of Owen's SUV or Sarah's government truck. This was smoother, quieter, the kind of sound that came from a vehicle that had never seen mud it couldn't avoid. A dark sedan, clean and out of place, rolled to a stop 20 yards from where they stood. The paint was immaculate, catching the filtered sunlight like polished stone. City car, money car, wrong car for these woods. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. She moved with controlled precision, shutting the door with a sound that was somehow both soft and final. She wore a navy coat, fitted and clean, the kind meant for sidewalks and offices, not pine needles and frozen ground. Her hair was pulled back tight, dark brown shot through with hints of lighter copper where the sun hit it. Her skin was pale with a hint of color from the cold. But it was her eyes that caught Dalton's attention. Dark, intense, carrying the kind of grief that had burned past tears a long time ago and turned into something harder, something that could cut. She was 35 maybe, young enough to still have fight left, old enough to know how fights usually ended. She walked toward them without hesitation, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, her gaze going straight to the collar in Dalton's gloved hands. "Where did you get that?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness had cracks in it like ice over running water. Sarah stepped forward, protective. "Ma'am, I'm Ranger Whitmore. We're securing a potential scene." "Are you Claire Ross?" The woman's eyes flicked to Sarah's badge, then back to Dalton. "Yes." Owen cleared his throat, and something in the sound carried recognition and resignation. "Claire, you shouldn't be here." Claire turned on him, and the single word she spoke carried years of swallowed anger. "Don't," She looked at Owen like she'd learned not to trust uniforms a long time ago. Like she'd been told to wait and be patient and let the system work for so many years that the words had lost all meaning. Then she looked back at Dalton. Her eyes moved over him, cataloging the military bearing, the weathered face, the quiet posture that wasn't relaxed so much as controlled. Her gaze settled on Valor, and something in her expression faltered. Not softened exactly, but shifted. "That dog," she said quietly. "Where did you get him?" Dalton's voice came out low. "He was assigned to my unit. Later, after I left active duty, I took him when he retired." Claire's jaw tightened. Assigned like equipment. Dalton felt the sting because it wasn't fully wrong. "He's not equipment," he said. Valor stepped forward half a pace and sat. Not the alert sit from before, but a calm, grounded sit. He looked up at Claire, steady and direct, with the kind of focus that said he was reading her the way he read everything, measuring pain and anger and need without judgment. Claire swallowed hard. Her hand lifted as if she might reach for the mic, then stopped in midair like she didn't trust herself not to break if she made contact. "That collar," she whispered, staring at the engraved plate. "My brother wore one like that on his belt. Like a reminder. Like proof he mattered to someone." Dalton's chest tightened. "Your brother was Elijah." Claire flinched at the name. "Was Bwim," she echoed, and that single syllable carried a whole funeral. Sarah intervened, voice brisk and professional. "We're still processing. We can't confirm anything yet." Claire laughed, once bitter. "You can't confirm. You mean you won't, just like last time." Owen's face reddened. "Claire, it's not like that." Claire turned on him with the kind of anger that had been refined over decades into something surgical. "Isn't it because I remember you showing up at our house 27 years ago? I was 8 years old. I remember you saying there was nothing more to do. I remember my mother asking where his truck was and you not meeting her eyes." Owen's shoulders sagged under the weight of memory. Whatever had happened back then had carved a groove into him, and he'd been walking in it ever since, unable to step out, unable to change direction. Dalton stood quietly watching the exchange, feeling something cold settle in his gut. A file closed. A family left with no answers. A system that decided some truths were too expensive to pursue. Valor's ears angled toward the trees again, not alarmed but attentive. Always working, always aware. Dalton noticed and felt his pulse shift. Owen stepped closer to Dalton, lowering his voice so only he could hear. His words came out tight and urgent. "Don't talk about the collar to anyone else." Dalton stared at him. "Why, Bwome?" Owen's eyes flicked to Sarah, to Claire, then to the forest like it had ears, like something in the trees might be listening. "Because somebody wanted this buried," he whispered, "and somebody still does." Dalton's hand tightened around the old collar, still in its evidence bag, now sealed and labeled. "Who?" Owen swallowed. His voice dropped even further, almost lost in wind and pine. "The one who told me to sign the closure. The one who made sure it stayed quiet." Dalton felt the world narrow to that sentence. "Name." Owen's throat worked. His eyes held a warning and a plea at the same time. "I can't," he breathed. "Not out here, not like this." Valor looked up at Dalton, and in those dark eyes there was no fear. Only insistence, like a promise that had already been made and wouldn't be unmade no matter what came next. Sarah called out, professional again. "Deputy, we need to move this process along. Ms. Ross will take your statement." Mercer stepped back from the evidence. Dalton took one slow step back, but his mind didn't step back. It leaned forward into the dark space where the word closure lived, where files got shut without explanation, where truth could be buried without a grave. And somewhere under all that, a smaller thought formed, sharp and unwanted. If a file could be closed without recovery, then a truth could be erased without consequence. And if that was true, then the world was uglier than he wanted to believe. He looked at Valor. The dog stood, body calm but eyes still scanning like a sentry that never slept. Dalton felt the dog tag in his pocket again, cold against his thigh. A name, a message, a collar, and a deputy who looked like he'd been carrying a secret long enough to hate the weight of it. Owen met Dalton's gaze one last time and mouthed, barely audible, two words that landed like stones. "Be careful." Then he turned away, shoulders tense, as if he'd just stepped across a line he'd avoided for 27 years and wasn't sure he could step back. The town library sat at the edge of Main Street like it had been built to survive winters and secrets both. Its brick walls were dark red, almost brown in the afternoon light, and the windows reflected pine trees and sky, as if the building couldn't decide whether it belonged to the town or the forest. A small American flag snapped gently in the breeze outside. The world looked normal, families passing with coffee, A pickup truck rolling by, exhaust puffing white in the cold. The faint sound of someone laughing from the diner across the street. Dalton hated how normal it all looked. He came in with Valor at his side, leashed short, not because the dog needed it, but because Dalton needed something in his hand that felt real. The metal dog tag in his pocket felt like a stone in his stomach. The memory of Owen's warning rode between his shoulder blades like a cold draft. Somebody wanted this buried. Dalton had buried enough things in his life. The problem was that buried things always found a way to rot, and rot had a smell that eventually reached the surface. A bell chimed softly as the door opened. The air inside smelled of paper and dust and lemon cleaner, an oddly comforting mix like childhood and responsibility had made a truce and agreed to coexist. The library was warm compared to outside, but Dalton still felt chilled. Behind the front desk, a woman looked up from a stack of returned books. She was in her late 30s, medium height, with the kind of energy that made quiet spaces feel awake without making them loud. Maeve Sullivan had warm hazel eyes magnified slightly by thick framed glasses and a mess of auburn hair pinned up in a loose knot that looked 3 minutes away from escaping entirely. She wore a thick cardigan that had survived a decade of coffee spills and small victories, and her smile was easy, but her eyes were sharp. "Mercer," she said, voice carrying humor like a hidden pocket knife. "You look like you tried to have a peaceful morning and the universe took it personally." Dalton exhaled a short laugh he didn't fully mean. "Something like that." Maeve leaned over the desk to look at Valor. "And you brought your colleague." Valor's ears twitched. He didn't wag. He simply observed her the way he observed everyone, like a polite bouncer deciding whether to let someone into a private room. Maeve's smile softened. "Hi there, handsome. You're either very well trained or very judgmental." "Both," Dalton said. Maeve waved them around the desk with a small, decisive motion. "Back room. You're not pacing the public stacks like a haunted lumberjack." They moved past rows of shelves and quiet study tables. Dalton caught curious glances from a couple of patrons, mostly because Valor's presence was hard to ignore. A German Shepherd moved differently than a Golden Retriever. More purpose, less apology. Dalton didn't care. He'd learned long ago that if you waited for people to stop looking, you'd never move. Maeve led them through a door marked staff only and down a short hallway to a room that felt different from the rest of the library. This space had no cozy reading chairs or bright children's posters. It was all metal shelving file boxes and the stale smell of paper that had been handled too many times. An archive room, Truth's pantry. On the far wall stood a row of filing cabinets. Most were old dull gray, with scratches and faded labels that looked like they'd been typed on machines that required physical force to operate. One cabinet, however, looked wrong. It was the same style as the others, but its lock was newer. Shiny brass unscuffed like a fresh bandage on an old wound. Maeve pointed at it. "That lock showed up last month." Dalton frowned. "Libraries replace locks." "Sure," Maeve said. "If they break, or if somebody wants to make sure nobody remembers where they put something." She crouched and ran her finger along the edge of the lock mechanism. "This cabinet contains old county miscellaneous files. The kind nobody asks about unless they're either bored or desperate." Dalton didn't like the word desperate. It sounded too much like the place his mind always tried to avoid. "Can you open it?" he asked quietly. Maeve lifted a ring of keys from her pocket. "I can open anything in this building." Then with a quick glance at his face, she added softer, "Sometimes I wish I couldn't." She unlocked the cabinet and pulled out a folder. The label was faded but legible, typed on a label maker that had probably stopped working during the Reagan administration. North Star Freight Incidents. Dalton's throat tightened. Maeve slid the folder onto a metal table and opened it like she was performing surgery. Inside were photocopies of reports, handwritten notes, old memos. Many pages looked like they'd been copied, and returned more than once, as if the same question had been asked repeatedly and never answered the same way twice. Dalton's eyes caught on a torn page near the middle. Half the sentence was missing, ripped away cleanly, but the remaining text sat there like a bruise. "Do not recover vehicle. Do not contact family." Dalton stared at the words until they began to feel less like ink and more like an order being spoken into his ear by a voice he'd spent 27 years trying to forget. Maeve watched him. "You okay?" He nodded, even though he wasn't. "That's not normal." "No," Maeve agreed. "It's not." She flipped deeper into the folder. The more she turned, the worse the story smelled, like bureaucracy had been used as disinfectant over something rotten. "Who wrote that note?" Dalton asked. Maeve tapped the margin where a signature should have been. "That part's missing." "Convenient, right?" A voice came from the doorway behind them, calm and professional. It's not missing. It was removed. Ranger Sarah Whitmore stepped into the archive room, boots quiet on the linoleum. Her expression was stern, but her eyes carried a careful concern. She held a manila envelope under one arm, as if she'd brought more weather into the building with her. I told dispatch I'd be here, Sarah said to Maeve. I wanted this on record. Maeve raised her hands in mock surrender. Technically, everything in this building is on record. That's the whole point. Sarah's mouth twitched in almost a smile. Almost. Then she looked at Dalton. Deputy Nash is filing a preliminary report. He says you're cooperating. Dalton didn't answer right away. Cooperating sounded too close to obeying, and he'd obeyed enough orders for one lifetime. Some of them had been right. Some of them had gotten people killed. The difference wasn't always clear until it was too late. Sarah set the envelope on the table. I brought a copy of the official closure notice. Maeve's eyebrows lifted. There's an official closure notice, Sarah nodded. It exists, signed, filed. She paused. But the file doesn't match the reality in the woods. Dalton's hands curled into fists, then relaxed. He forced his voice steady. That's the point, isn't it? Maeve skimmed the closure notice and let out a quiet, unhappy laugh. This reads like a bedtime story. No further action required. Like the truck just floated away on a dream. Dalton's jaw tightened. Someone wanted it gone without being found. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Or wanted it found later, under the right conditions. The idea landed like a pebble in Dalton's gut. Small, but heavy. Why would someone want that? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She looked at Valor instead. The dog had been unusually still since entering the archive room. He wasn't restless the way many dogs were in tight indoor spaces. He sat near Dalton's boot eyes, scanning corners, nose lifting, occasionally as if tasting scents the humans couldn't smell. Then Valor stood. He moved away from Dalton and crossed to the far wall straight toward a small shelf near the staff workstation, where an old printer sat idle gray and forgotten. The machine looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. The paper tray was half full of blank sheets gathering dust. Valor stopped in front of it and stared. Not at the printer itself, at the bottom shelf beneath it where a small plastic trash bin sat. He lowered his head and huffed softly. One controlled breath. Not a bark, not even close. Just acknowledgement. Maeve blinked. Okay, that's new? Dalton's pulse kicked up. Valor. The dog didn't respond. He nudged the trash bin lightly with his nose, careful and deliberate. Sarah's posture tightened. What's he doing? Dalton stepped closer, careful. He looked down into the bin. Half hidden under crumpled draft paper and a used coffee filter was a single sheet, too clean to belong in trash. The paper's edges were sharp like it had been placed there gently, not tossed. Dalton reached for it, then hesitated. Evidence. Procedure. He could hear Owen's voice in his head like a leash pulling him back. Gloves, Sarah said quietly. Dalton pulled a pair from his jacket pocket, slipped them on, and lifted the sheet carefully. The words were printed in plain black ink. No letterhead, no signature. Just a sentence that made Dalton's stomach drop like an elevator with cut cables. He wasn't the driver. Maeve went still. That wasn't there yesterday. Sarah's eyes narrowed. And it wasn't printed from our system, Maeve added, leaning forward to check a timestamp in the corner that wasn't there. This is recent, within the last 12 hours. Dalton turned the paper over, blank. Sarah asked, how would someone get this into the archive room? Maeve pointed upward toward the ceiling, tracing an invisible path. Staff entrance is locked. Public entrance has cameras. Sarah looked at the security monitor on the staff desk, a small screen showing grainy black and white feeds from 3 different angles. Then we check footage. Maeve tapped the keyboard, fast, fingers confident. Video popped up on screen. Hallways, doors, empty spaces. They rewound to the early morning before sunrise, before the library opened. The hallway appeared on screen silent and empty, lit only by emergency exit lights that cast everything in sickly green. Then the screen stuttered. A brief freeze. The timestamp jumped forward. Exactly 1 minute gone. Not a glitch that blurred or a camera that died. A clean surgical slice like someone had reached into the recording and cut out 60 seconds with a scalpel. Dalton felt his mouth go dry. Maeve whispered, somebody edited this. Sarah's voice was controlled but sharp. This isn't amateur hour. This is someone with access and training. Dalton stared at that missing minute on the screen, and something in his mind snapped back to a different missing minute. Kosovo, 1999. A radio transmission that lasted less than 60 seconds. A voice calling for help. An order to ignore it. a decision that took no time at all and haunted him for 27 years. He wasn't sure if he was angry at the person who edited the footage or at the part of himself that understood exactly how easy it was to erase a moment when erasing was more convenient than explaining. Valor suddenly stiffened, not in alarm but in focus. His head turned toward the air vent near the ceiling, the kind that carried sound and smell from other parts of the building. He lifted his nose and inhaled slowly like a man smelling smoke from a fire that hadn't started yet. Then Valor walked back to Dalton quiet and deliberate and pressed his muzzle against Dalton's jacket pocket, the pocket where Dalton had tucked the metal dog tag. The dog held there, breathing once, twice, steady and controlled. Dalton froze. It wasn't a demand, it wasn't a warning. It felt like Valor was confirming something, as if the dog wasn't reacting to the paper or the missing minute anymore, but to the name Dalton carried. Maeve watched the gesture, her humor gone. He knows that tag matters. Sarah's voice lowered. Or he knows someone else knows. Dalton's heart hammered as he looked down at Valor. The dog's eyes met his, dark and unwavering and painfully loyal. For one strange moment, Dalton felt like the forest itself had followed them into the library, quietly insisting that this wasn't over just because they'd moved indoors. And Dalton understood with cold clarity that whoever was behind this wasn't just watching the truck. They were watching him. Sarah broke the silence first. We need an outside specialist, someone who understands canine behavior and can check your dog for anything unusual, tracking devices, injuries, anything abnormal. Dalton's jaw tightened. Valor's fine. Sarah didn't argue. Fine dogs still get used. Maeve nodded reluctantly. There's a vet clinic 2 streets down. Dr. Juliet Rains, she's good. Worked with police K9 units before she went private. As if summoned by the mention, Sarah pulled out her phone and made a quick call. 5 minutes later, they were walking the 2 blocks to the clinic, Valor moving at Dalton's side with the same steady professionalism he always carried. The veterinary clinic was a small brick building with a hand-painted sign that had faded slightly over the years, but still carried warmth. Inside, it smelled like antiseptic and dog shampoo, with a faint undercurrent of hay from the large animal practice next door. Dr. Juliet Rains was waiting for them. She was in her early 40s, average height, with dark blonde hair pulled into a low ponytail. Her face had gentle lines around the eyes that came from years of focusing on animals who couldn't explain their pain. She wore a practical navy fleece over scrubs, and a stethoscope hung around her neck like a permanent accessory. Her gaze went straight to Valor, and her expression softened into professional respect. "This is Valor?" she asked. Dalton nodded. "Yes." Dr. Rains crouched slowly, letting Valor sniff her hand first. Standard protocol. Valor did, then sat calm but alert. She studied him the way a reader studies a sentence that might hide a second meaning. "He's disciplined," she said almost to herself. "And he's carrying something, not physically, emotionally. Dogs do that." Dalton felt his throat tighten. "He's a dog." Dr. Rains looked up at him, kind but firm. "And you're a man. That doesn't stop either of you from remembering." Sarah's radio crackled softly. She stepped aside to listen to dispatch, responding about the trail cam logs. Maeve held up the printed paper like it might burn. "Someone planted this message." Dr. Rains nodded. "Then your dog reacted for a reason. He's reading cues you don't see. Smell, stress patterns, body language." Dalton stared at the sentence again. The 4 words that didn't make sense and made too much sense at the same time. He wasn't the driver. If Elijah Ross wasn't the driver of his own truck, then who was? And why did that feel like it had something to do with Dalton's own missing minute, his own failure to listen when listening mattered most? Dr. Rains gestured toward an exam room. "Let me check him properly." Inside the small clean room, she had Valor stand on the exam table. She moved with practiced efficiency, checking his eyes, his teeth, his ears, running her hands along his body, feeling for lumps or injuries or anything out of place. Then she unbuckled his tactical collar, the thick padded kind designed for working dogs. She laid it flat on the table and began examining it closely, fingers probing the padding. "These collars have reinforced sections," she explained. "Good for protection, also good for hiding things." She pulled out a small tool, something like a seam ripper, and began carefully separating the inner lining from the outer fabric. And there it was, small as a pill, black plastic, unnervingly modern against the worn fabric. A GPS tracker. Dalton felt his face go cold. All the blood seemed to drain from his head and pool somewhere in his stomach, turning to ice. Dr. Rains held it up between her fingers, turning it in the light. "This is not standard canine equipment. It's aftermarket. Consumer grade, but high quality. Whoever put this here wanted to follow him without you knowing. Sarah's eyes snapped to Dalton. So that's how they keep showing up. How they knew you'd find the truck. Dalton stared at the device, anger tightening his throat until words became difficult. When, he managed, Dr. Raines's voice stayed level and clinical. Could have been any time someone got close enough. A handshake, a friendly stranger petting your dog, a moment at a doorway. These things are small, easy to slip into place if you know what you're doing. Maeve's voice shook slightly. So they've been tracking you this whole time, since before you found the truck. The implications settled over the room like cold fog. They hadn't stumbled onto the truck. They'd been led to it, guided, watched every step of the way. Sarah took the tracker, now sealed in a small evidence bag. This goes in my report, chain of custody. Dalton looked down at Valor. The dog sat on the exam table, calm and patient, as if waiting for the humans to finish catching up to what he'd known all along. That nothing about this morning had been accidental. That the forest hadn't kept the secret for 27 years just to give it up randomly. That someone had been waiting for exactly the right person to come looking, and Dalton Stone Mercer, whether he liked it or not, was that person. He reached out and ran his hand over Valor's head, feeling the warm, solid reality of the animal, the steady heartbeat, the quiet loyalty that asked for nothing except to be trusted. Good boy, Dalton murmured, and the words carried weight they'd never carried before. Not just praise, acknowledgement, an apology for not understanding sooner. Valor leaned into the touch just slightly, just enough to say he forgave everything, because forgiveness was what dogs did when humans finally started listening. Outside the clinic, the afternoon light was fading into that particular gray that came before evening. The temperature was dropping. Dalton's breath came out in visible clouds. Sarah looked at her phone, frowning. Dispatch confirmed it. Trail cam near the service road is gone, not malfunction, removed. Maeve rubbed her arms against the cold. Who removes a trail cam besides teenagers and criminals? Sarah's eyes were hard. Someone who doesn't want a record of who came and went. Dalton didn't answer. His mind kept circling the same thought, the same terrible logic. A message carved into a steering wheel with his nickname on it. A dog tag buried like a time capsule. A GPS tracker hidden in his dog's collar. Footage edited with professional precision. Someone wasn't just hiding a crime. They were orchestrating a reveal, controlling the narrative, making sure the truth came out exactly when and how they wanted it to. But why? And who had that kind of patience, that kind of control, that kind of access? Dalton felt the weight of the Majestag in his pocket, the weight of Elijah Ross's name, the weight of 27 years of silence that was finally ending. Not with a bang, with a whisper that kept getting louder. Sarah looked at Dalton, and in her eyes he saw the same calculation he was making. You need to be careful, she said. Whoever's behind this has resources. They've had decades to set this up. Maeve added quietly, and they're not finished yet. Valor stood close to Dalton's leg, warm and solid and real, a reminder that some things couldn't be tracked or controlled or manipulated. Loyalty, trust. The bond between a man and the animal that chose to stand beside him, even when standing, became dangerous. Dalton looked down at his dog and made a decision he probably should have made 27 years ago. Then we stop running, he said quietly, and we find out what Elijah Ross wanted us to know. The sky above them darkened another shade, and somewhere in the distance, the first stars began to appear cold and distant, and watching like the universe itself was waiting to see what happened when a man finally stopped ignoring the signal and started listening to what the silence had been trying to say all along. By late afternoon, the town looked like it had forgotten how to be afraid. Sunlight lay across the sidewalks in long, honey-colored strips, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it was. Snow melt from earlier weeks had dried into pale stains along the curb. A couple of kids rode bikes in lazy circles near the diner, laughing like the world had never hidden anything in its woods. Dalton Mercer watched it all from the library steps, calm but braced. Ready, but hoping he wouldn't have to be. Valor stood at his side leash, slack but present. The German shepherd's posture was composed, professional, as if his body had decided that this quiet town was a temporary illusion, and underneath it something sharper waited. His ears shifted constantly, catching small sounds. The bell above the library door, the soft rumble of a truck engine in the distance, the whisper of wind sliding between buildings. Claire Ross lingered near the curb, arms folded tight across her navy coat. Her face had settled into a hard stillness. Grief turned into a blade she kept close. She didn't look at Dalton as much now. She looked through him, trying to see the shape of truth behind his ribs. Ranger Sarah Whitmore stepped outside, her Forest Service jacket open, despite the cold radio clipped high on her shoulder. She looked like she belonged more under pine branches than streetlights. Her boots sounded too heavy on the concrete, like a reminder that the woods were never far, that wildness was always closer than people wanted to believe. "We can't talk in the library anymore," Sarah said, her poise carrying quiet authority. "Someone's been inside our footage. That means they have access or capability or both." Maeve Sullivan pushed through the door behind her, one hand holding a paper cup of coffee. Her curls were slightly frizzed from static, her glasses riding low on her nose. She looked like she'd been born to turn secrets into sentences. "So where do we talk?" Maeve asked. "My truck. Now." They started toward the parking lot, boots crunching on gravel and old snow that hadn't quite melted. The temperature was dropping as the sun sank lower. February in Montana didn't forgive. It just waited. That was when the dark sedan slid into view. It wasn't a local car. It moved too smoothly, too carefully, as if it expected the road to obey it. The paint was clean in a way that didn't match small-town winter. The windows were tinted just enough to feel impolite. It pulled into a spot near Sarah's truck and stopped with practiced precision. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine idled. The windows stayed dark. Then the driver's door opened. Victor Kane stepped out. Late 40s or early 50s, tall and lean, with controlled posture. His hair was dark blonde, combed back neatly, barely disturbed by the wind. His face was sharp in a practiced way. High cheekbones, a narrow jaw, a smile that appeared quickly and disappeared even faster. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter sky before snow, and they didn't warm when he smiled. Eyes that measured distance and risk before they measured people. He wore a dark wool coat cut clean at the shoulders, gloves thin enough to be stylish and functional, and shoes that looked too new for the gravel parking lot. A silver watch flashed briefly at his wrist. Expensive, bright, out of place. He walked toward them with confidence, like he already belonged in the conversation. "Ranger Whitmore," Victor said, his voice smooth as lake ice in January. "Deputy Nash said I might find you here." Sarah's shoulders stiffened. "Deputy Nash didn't tell me that." Victor smiled as if misunderstanding was charming. "Well, I'm telling you now." He offered a hand. Sarah didn't take it. Dalton didn't move. Valor didn't bark. The dog simply shifted half a step closer to Dalton, body squared, weight balanced, eyes fixed on Victor's hands. Victor noticed the dog and paused, smile still in place but adjusting slightly. "Beautiful shepherd, working line, I'd guess. Retired K9. "Yes," Dalton answered, voice flat. Victor's gaze flicked up to Dalton's face, and for a brief second, the smile became more precise, more deliberate. "Mercer," Victor said, and the way he said it landed like a fingertip tapping Dalton's chest. Dalton felt the word physically. "Do I know you?" Victor spread his hands slightly, an innocent gesture that felt anything but. "Not personally, but I make it my business to know the people involved in complicated matters." Sarah stepped forward, voice clipped. "If you're here about the vehicle, it's an active investigation." "I understand," Victor said easily. "That's exactly why I'm here. I represent a private conservation group interested in purchasing land near the North Ridge area. Ecological preservation, protecting the forest from careless development." Maeve snorted softly. "Ecological preservation in a sedan that's never seen mud." Victor turned to her, smile widening. "And you are Maeve, librarian, keeper of paper, enemy of nonsense." Victor chuckled once, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Charming." Sarah's tone sharpened. "That area isn't for sale." "Everything is for sale," Victor replied, still polite. "Sometimes it simply depends on who's authorized to sign." The air tightened. Sarah's jaw worked. "This is federal and county overlap," she said. "There are regulations, procedures." Victor nodded as if listening to a child recite lessons. "Of course, regulations, procedures." He said the words like he'd tasted them before and found them bland. "I'm not here to break rules, Ranger. I'm here to streamline a solution." Claire's voice cut through, cold and direct. "What kind of solution involves a missing man and a truck swallowed by trees for 27 years? Victor looked at her with mild interest. "You must be Miss Ross." Claire's eyes narrowed. "And you must be the kind of man who knows too much." Victor's expression shifted into something almost sympathetic. "I know enough to want everyone to move on, to find peace." Then he turned back to Dalton and his smile sharpened into something with edges. "So not," Victor said, and the nickname landed like a slap. The world seemed to tilt. Dalton didn't blink, but something in his chest went cold. He had not introduced himself as Stone. Not in this town. Not to anyone here. That name lived in personnel files and mission reports and the memories of people who'd served with him in places the government didn't talk about. Sarah's eyes snapped to Dalton, then back to Victor. How do you know that name? Victor's smile held steady, but his pupils tightened slightly. People with backgrounds like Mr. Mercer's leave trails. Not the kind you hike, the kind that show up in paperwork, service records, commendations. Dalton's voice was low, controlled, dangerous. You don't have access to my service records. No, Victor said, and the question hung there. Valor's ears rose. The dog's mouth tightened, lips drawing back just enough to show a hint of tooth. Not a snarl, not yet, just an understated warning. Victor noticed. He took one careful step back, still smiling, hands visible. Relax, I'm not here to threaten anyone. But then he pulled out his phone, turned it toward them with casual precision. On the screen was a photo, recent. This morning, judging by the light, a young woman walking into a bookstore, coffee in hand, completely unaware. Dark hair pulled back, practical jacket. The storefront behind her read Capitol Hill Books in faded letters. Your daughter, isn't she? Victor said, looking at Dalton. Cassidy, 28 years old, lives in Seattle, works at this bookstore. The world stopped. Sarah's hand moved toward her sidearm. Maeve gasped. Claire went rigid, but it was Valor who moved first. The dog stepped fully in front of Dalton. Hackles raised a low rumble, building in his chest that Dalton had only heard twice before, both times in combat. Not a bark, not a growl. Something deeper. Something primal. Dalton's voice came out flat and deadly. If you go near my daughter, I won't have to, Victor interrupted smoothly, raising his hands in mock innocence. Because you're going to stop digging. You're going to let this file stay closed. You're going to go back to your quiet life. He gestured to the phone still in his hand. Today's photo, taken 4 hours ago, just so you know this isn't a bluff. Maeve's voice shook with barely controlled rage. You're threatening a civilian. I'm providing information, Victor corrected. What people do with information is their choice. Claire stepped forward, but Victor spoke first, addressing Dalton again. You think doing the right thing matters more than following orders? Victor said quietly. That's admirable. It's also what makes you predictable. Sarah's voice turned to ice. This conversation is over. Leave, now. Victor nodded as if agreeing, but his eyes stayed on Dalton. Of course, but I wanted Mr. Mercer to understand the full picture. Then he did something small but deliberate. He glanced at Valor, and Dalton understood in that moment that Victor wasn't simply interested in Dalton. He was interested in what Dalton carried beside him. A gust of wind swept down the street. With it came a scent Dalton couldn't name at first. Something sharp, chemical, faintly metallic. Valor's head snapped toward Victor's coat, not his face. The fabric itself. The dog inhaled, once slow and deep, nostrils flaring, and the muscles along his shoulders coiled tight. Then Valor turned his body sideways in front of Dalton, blocking, shielding, without being commanded. Not aggression, protection. Dalton's pulse kicked up because Valor wasn't reacting to Victor's tone or his words. He was reacting to Victor's scent. And Dalton realized with cold clarity that Victor didn't smell like a man who'd just driven in from a city office. He smelled like oil and rust and the inside of a place where metal had been left to rot for decades. Like he'd been closer to that truck than he was admitting. Victor's smile thinned slightly. Smart dog. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a plain envelope, not thick, not dramatic, just ordinary enough to be terrifying. He placed it on the hood of Sarah's truck, tapping it once with a gloved finger. A courtesy, so you understand I'm serious. Sarah didn't touch it. Maeve leaned forward cautiously. What's in it? Maeve asked. Victor's smile returned. Perspective. He turned to leave, then stopped as if remembering something. He looked back at Dalton. His voice dropped, became gentle and dangerous at the same time. You think you stumbled into this, Victor said slowly. But that truck didn't wait 27 years for a random jogger. It waited for you. Dalton's breath caught. Victor's eyes glinted in the fading afternoon light. That truck is pulling you back to a night you heard something. Kosovo, 1999. And then you chose to believe the wrong person. Dalton's voice cut through sharp. Stop. But Victor smiled anyway because he'd already done what he came to do. He tipped his head slightly, almost respectful. Good luck, Stone. Then he got into a sedan and drove away, the car sliding down Main Street like a dark thought the town tried not to have. For several seconds, no one moved. The wind picked up colder now, carrying the promise of snow. Sarah finally grabbed the envelope with 2 fingers. She flipped it open with practiced efficiency. Inside were glossy photographs. High resolution, professional quality. Shot from a distance with telephoto lenses. Dalton's cabin, his porch, his window curtains half drawn showing the silhouette of a man standing in lamplight. Not close enough to be a break-in, close enough to be a message. Maeve let out a breath that sounded like a laugh and a sob colliding. He's been watching you. Claire stared at the photos, face draining of color. For how long? The group stood in silence for a long moment after Victor's car disappeared. The photographs lay on the hood of Sarah's truck like evidence of violation. Claire's breathing was shallow, rapid. Her hands shook as she stared at the images. My brother, she whispered, 27 years, and they just buried him. Her voice broke. Her knees buckled slightly. Valor moved before anyone else could. The dog crossed to Claire and pressed against her legs, solid and warm. Not jumping, not demanding, just there. Present, offering the weight of his body as comfort. Claire's hand dropped to Valor's head automatically. Her fingers curled into his fur, gripping like it was the only thing keeping her upright. He knows, she said, voice thick with tears she wouldn't let fall. He knows what it's like to lose someone. Dalton watched, throat tight. Because Valor had never met Claire before today, had no training in therapy or emotional support beyond basic canine work, but the dog knew grief when he smelled it, knew loss, and responded the way he'd been built to respond, by standing beside it. Maeve wiped her eyes. Dogs are better than people sometimes. Most of the time, Sarah corrected quietly. After a moment, Valor returned to Dalton's side, mission complete. Dalton looked at Sarah, and in her eyes he saw the same calculation he was making. We're not dealing with a land buyer. Sarah nodded once. No. Maeve swallowed, eyes bright with fear she refused to show. So what are we dealing with? Dalton stared down Main Street where the sedan had disappeared. A man who thinks he owns closure. Valor pressed closer, silent, as a vow warm and solid against Dalton's leg. And Dalton realized the hardest part wasn't that Victor was watching. The hardest part was that Victor sounded right about one thing. The truck had not been an accident. It had been a summons. And Dalton Stone Mercer, whether he liked it or not, had answered. Evening came to Montana fast. The sun dropped behind the mountains and took all the warmth with it, leaving behind a sky that went from blue to purple to black in what felt like minutes. Dalton sat in his cabin, a small structure he'd built mostly himself over 2 years. Wood stove crackling. Single room with a loft for sleeping. Functional. Sparse. The kind of place that didn't ask questions. Valor lay near the stove, head on his paws, eyes open and watchful even in rest. Dalton held the dog tag in his palm, turning it over and over, feeling the weight of stamped metal and 27 years of silence. Elijah Ross, handler, Kosovo, spring 1999. The memory came back sharp and complete now that Dalton had stopped fighting it. He'd been 25 years old, third deployment. Part of a logistics and security team attached to NATO peacekeeping operations. The kind of work that didn't make headlines but kept the machinery running. Elijah Ross had been on the same detail. They'd shared guard shifts, bad coffee, worse jokes. Elijah talked about his dog Bruno the way some men talked about their children, with unguarded love. When I get home, Elijah had said one night, both of them bone-tired and staring at stars that looked the same everywhere. First thing I'm doing is taking Bruno to the lake. Let him run. Let him be a dyke instead of a soldier. 3 weeks later, Elijah had drawn convoy duty, routine transport through unstable territory. Radio check every 30 minutes. Dalton had been monitoring communications when the radio crackled to life at 0347 hours. Static, interference. Then a voice, faint but unmistakable. Stone, if you hear this, grid 48 north, not alone, Blackwell, wrong about, then nothing. Dalton had reported it immediately, had requested permission to investigate. The response came from Director Warren Blackwell himself, voice calm and certain over secure communications. Negative, Stone. That's thermal bounds from Serbian positions. Radio interference. We have confirmed GPS on all convoys. Ross is not in that grid. He's 40 kilometers south, exactly where he's supposed to be. Do not pursue ghosts. Maintain position. Blackwell had access Dalton didn't have. Satellite data, command authority, the weight of rank and information. So Dalton had obeyed. 6 hours later, Elijah Ross was listed as missing. Vehicle lost, presumed dead in hostile territory. The official report said mechanical failure during approved route. No foul play suspected. File closed with honors. But sitting here now, 27 years later, Dalton understood what his younger self hadn't wanted to see. Blackwell hadn't been wrong by accident. He'd been lying. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. Meet tomorrow, 9 a.m., my office. Owen has something important. Dalton typed back. Understood. He set the phone down and looked at Valor. The dog's eyes were on him, patient and knowing. Tomorrow we find out who gave the order, Dalton said quietly. Tomorrow we stop running. Valor's tail thumped once against the floor. Agreement, support. Outside the wind picked up, rattling the windows, carrying the smell of snow and pine, and the vast empty spaces where secrets lived. And somewhere in the darkness in a clearing, the forest had kept hidden for 27 years, a rusted truck sat waiting, its message still carved into rubber. Stone, if you're here, you're late. But late was better than never. The dog tag grew warm in his palm, warmed by his skin, by his grip, by the promise he was finally ready to keep. 9 o'clock the next morning found Dalton standing in Sarah Whitmore's office, a small, functional space that smelled of coffee and pine, and the particular dust that accumulated on government paperwork nobody wanted to file. Owen Nash sat in a chair that looked too small for him, hands clasped between his knees, face pale. He looked like a man who'd spent the night deciding whether to jump off a cliff and had finally chosen the cliff. On the desk between them sat a folder. Thin, official, damning. Claire stood near the door, rigid as steel. Maeve hovered by the window, coffee cup forgotten in her hand. Valor sat at Dalton's heel, alert but calm. This is the original closure order, Owen said quietly. His voice shook. The one I was told to sign 27 years ago. I kept a copy, hidden, in case... He trailed off. In case I ever got brave enough, the silence finished. Sarah opened the folder carefully. Her expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened. Dalton's eyes found the signature at the bottom of the page. Director Warren Blackwell. The name hit like a fist to the sternum. Dalton knew that name, had served under that authority structure, had trusted that voice on the radio when it said, ignore the signal. Blackwell, Dalton said the word, tasting like rust and betrayal. Owen nodded miserably. He was logistics oversight during Kosovo, moved into county-level authority after. Public safety coordinator. Still holds the position. Still has power. Sarah's voice was steel. This is an illegal order. It violates federal law, state law, every regulation we have. I know, Owen whispered. But he showed me a photo. My daughter, 6 years old, at school, and he said, do what you're told or learn what loss really means. Claire's voice cracked. So you chose your family over mine? Owen flinched. Yes. The honesty of it hung in the air. No justification, no excuse. Just the terrible truth of a man who'd made a choice and lived with it for 27 years. What changed? Dalton asked. Owen looked up, eyes red-rimmed. My daughter's 28 now, married, lives in Portland, has a son, and I realized I can't meet my grandson knowing I helped bury a good man to save my own skin. I can't do it anymore. Maeve's voice was soft. What else is in the file? Owen pulled out a second document. Elijah's last transmission. Official transcript. Never released. He handed it to Dalton. The words swam before Dalton's eyes. 0347 hours. Rossi to base. Grid 48 north, 114 west. Unauthorized cargo discovered. Repeat cargo does not match manifest. Request immediate backup. Director Blackwell on site. Blackwell ordering silence. This is not transmission ended. Dalton's hands shook. Blackwell was there. Well, not just there, Owen said. According to the incident log I found buried in archives, Blackwell personally authorized that convoy route, personally selected Elijah as driver, personally ordered comm silence in that sector. Sarah's eyes narrowed. What was the cargo? Experimental weapons components, Owen said. Unmarked, unregistered, being transported off-book to a buyer we were never supposed to know about. When Elijah discovered it and tried to report, Blackwell had to make a choice. And he chose to bury Elijah, Claire said, voice hollow. Owen nodded. The truck was driven into the forest and abandoned, made to look like Elijah went off route and got lost. By the time anyone searched, the trail was cold. The cargo had been moved, and Blackwell ordered the file closed to prevent anyone from digging deeper. Dalton felt rage building in his chest, hot and clean. Where's Blackwell now? Still local, Sarah said. Still in power, untouchable because he's connected, because he knows where bodies are buried, literally. Maeve set her coffee down. So what do we do? Dalton looked at each of them in turn. We make him confess, publicly, where he can't bury it again. How? Claire asked. We give Elijah the memorial he deserves, Dalton said. Public, by the lake. We invite the press, we invite witnesses, and we make Blackwell show his hand. Sarah's eyes gleamed. You think he'll come? I know he will, Dalton said, because if we're holding a memorial, we're making noise. And noise is what he spent 27 years trying to silence. 2 days later, the shore of Clearwater Lake was lined with people, more than Dalton had expected. Townspeople, veterans, journalists who'd caught wind of a story. The water lay calm and glassy, reflecting pale blue sky. Pines ringed the shore. Sunlight bounced off gentle ripples and threw moving patterns onto the sand. Maeve had brought a small wooden stand, the kind usually used for community notices. Today it held a simple printed page with a name at the top. Elijah Ross, 1974 to 1999. Gone but not forgotten. Below it, Claire had placed the K9 collar they'd found. The engraved plate caught the light. Sarah stood nearby, uniform pressed, posture formal. Owen stood a few steps behind, face-set eyes carrying the weight of his decision. Maeve had set up a camera on a tripod. Live streaming, she'd whispered to Dalton, to 3 different platforms. He can't shut them all down. Dalton held the metal dog tag, now properly documented. Sarah had cleared the release for one personal item to be present. Claire stepped forward. The wind lifted a few strands of her hair, softening her for a moment into someone younger. She placed the collar on the stand beside the name. Her hands trembled as she let go. Then she looked at Dalton. Do it. Dalton lifted a small whistle from his pocket. Metal? Found in the tin box inside the truck. A K9 recall whistle. He brought it to his lips and blew one short, clear note. The sound cut across the water, thin and precise, impossible to ignore. Valor's head lifted instantly, ears forward, eyes brightening with something like recognition and sorrow braided together. The dog stood perfectly still, as if the whistle had connected him to something larger than himself. For a heartbeat, nothing answered but wind and distant gulls. Then from the tree line came movement. A figure stepped into view. Not a ghost, not Elijah returned from the dead. A man in his 60s, tall, silver hair, expensive suit that looked wrong for the setting, face weathered but confident. Director Warren Blackwell. He walked toward the gathering with the slow inevitability of someone who knew he'd been summoned and chose to answer anyway. 2 security personnel flanked him, but they looked uncomfortable, uncertain. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People recognized him. Authority, power. Blackwell stopped at the edge of the memorial space. His eyes found Dalton. Mr. Mercer, he said, voice smooth, this is a touching tribute, but I'm afraid it's based on misinformation. Dalton's voice was quiet. Is it? Elijah Ross died in the line of duty. Blackwell continued, addressing the crowd now. A tragic accident. His service was honored. His family was compensated. This spectacle serves no one. Claire stepped forward. My family was never compensated. We were told to stop asking questions. Blackwell's expression remained pleasant. Grief can distort memory, Ms. Ross. Oh, can it distort this? Sarah held up the closure order, the signature visible even from a distance. Your signature, ordering the file closed without recovery, ordering no contact with family. Blackwell's smile thinned. Operational security, standard protocol for missions in hostile territory. Was it standard protocol to be present at the convoy? Dalton asked. To personally authorize the route, to order calm silence. Blackwell's eyes hardened. I don't know what you think you found, but we found the transcript, Owen said, stepping forward. His voice shook but held. The last transmission, where Elijah reported unauthorized cargo and specifically named you as being on site. Blackwell's face went carefully blank. That's classified information, illegally obtained. Then explain it, Dalton said. Oh, days. Publicly, right now. Tell everyone here why you were present at a convoy that went missing, why you ordered silence, why you buried a good man. The crowd pressed closer, phone cameras raised. Maeve's live stream counter ticked past 500 viewers. 1,000, 2,000. Blackwell looked at the cameras, at the crowd, at the trap closing around him. His voice turned cold. You're making accusations you can't prove. Can we? Sarah pulled out another document. Because I requested the original cargo manifest from NATO archives. Took some doing, but it's publicly available if you know where to look. Want to tell everyone what was really in that convoy? Blackwell's jaw clenched. This is harassment. This is justice, Claire said. For a moment, Blackwell looked like he might walk away, might call their bluff. Then Valor moved. The dog walked forward, slow and deliberate, and sat directly in front of Blackwell. Not threatening, not aggressive, just there. bearing witness. Blackwell looked down at the mom and something in his expression cracked. You have no idea what you're interfering with, he said quietly. No idea what's at stake. Then tell us, Dalton said. Blackwell's eyes swept the crowd again. The cameras, the witnesses, the trap. He smiled, but it was bitter. You want the truth? Fine. Ross discovered weapons components being transported without authorization. Experimental tech that was supposed to be destroyed under treaty agreements. But certain parties wanted them preserved, studied, sold. The crowd murmured. Camera zoomed. I was overseeing the operation, Blackwell continued. When Ross threatened to report it, I made a choice. The needs of national security outweighed one man's conscience. Claire's voice shook with rage. You killed him. I ordered him to stand down, Blackwell corrected. He refused. He tried to transmit coordinates. I had to stop him. How? Dalton's voice was deadly quiet. Blackwell met his eyes. The vehicle was disabled. Remotely, he was left with supplies and a transponder. He was supposed to be recovered after the cargo was secured. But he wasn't, Sarah said. Blackwell's mask slipped. For the first time, something like regret showed. There were complications. By the time we could return safely, he was gone. We assumed he'd succumbed to the environment, and the environment. It was an acceptable loss. The words hung in the air like poison. Acceptable, Claire repeated, voice breaking. My brother was an acceptable loss. Blackwell looked at her. He knew the risks when he enlisted. Owen stepped forward, pulling handcuffs from his belt. Director Warren Blackwell, you're under arrest for... Blackwell's hand moved toward his jacket. Valor exploded into motion. The dog launched forward, jaws closing on Blackwell's forearm before his hand reached whatever weapon he had been going for. Not biting hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to hold the control to stop. Blackwell shouted. His security personnel reached for their weapons. Don't, Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. She had her sidearm drawn, pointed steady. Federal officer, drop your weapons, now. The security men hesitated, then complied. Owen moved in, pulling Blackwell's arm behind his back, cuffing him efficiently, while Valor released and stepped back to Dalton's side. The dog's mouth was clean. No blood, just control. Dalton's hand dropped to Valor's head. Good boy, he whispered. The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed. The live stream viewer count hit 10,000. Blackwell struggled against the cuffs. You can't prove any of this. My word against a dead man's. No, Sarah said, holding up her phone. Your word on camera, confession recorded, witnessed by 200 people and broadcast to thousands more. Blackwell's face went white as he realized what he'd done. State police arrived within minutes, summoned by Sarah's earlier call. They took Blackwell into custody, reading him his rights as cameras documented every second. As they led him away, he looked back at Dalton one last time. You think this ends anything, Blackwell said. I understand him. You think you've won? Dalton's voice was quiet. I think Elijah Ross finally got his memorial. Blackwell was loaded into a police vehicle and driven away. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring, processing what they'd witnessed. Claire stood at the memorial, staring at her brother's name. Dalton approached carefully. I'm sorry it took 27 years. Claire's voice was thick. You heard him that night, and you were told to ignore it. Yes. And you did. Yes. She turned to face him. Tears streaked her face, but her eyes were clear. Thank you for finally listening. Dalton nodded, throat too tight for words. Maeve approached, phone in hand. The video's gone viral. 500,000 views already. News outlets are calling. This isn't going away. Sarah joined them. Federal investigators are already requesting copies of everything we have. Blackwell's done. Owen stood apart, looking smaller, somehow older. Dalton walked over to him. You did the right thing. Owen's laugh was hollow. 27 years late. Late is better than never, Dalton said. 4 months later, Dalton stood on the porch of a small ranch house near Glacier National Park. The property wasn't large, just 15 acres of meadow and pine, but it was his. Paid for with the compensation the Department of Defense had been forced to provide after Blackwell's arrest triggered a cascade of investigations. $820,000. Blood money maybe, but money that gave Dalton something he hadn't had in years. A future. Valor lay on the porch, nose pointed toward the mountains, watching the world with patient satisfaction. Inside boxes were still half unpacked. Dalton had started working at the FBI Academy in Quantico 3 days a week, training PTSD service dogs for veterans. The commute was long, but the work mattered. His phone rang. Cassidy. Hey, Dad. Hey, kiddo. Just checking in, making sure you're settling in okay? Getting there. Good. A pause. I saw the news. They're saying Blackwell's getting 18 years. Yeah. Does it feel like enough? Dalton looked out at the mountains, at the vast clean spaces where the air was thin and the sky was big, and the past felt a little farther away. It feels like closure, he said. They talked for a few more minutes, making plans for her to visit in the summer, normal things that felt almost foreign after months of chaos. When he hung up, he walked to the edge of the porch and sat beside Valor. The dog leaned against him warm and solid. We did it, Dalton said quietly. We found him. We gave him justice. Valor's tail thumped twice. In the distance, a hawk circled. The sun moved lower. The world kept turning. And Dalton Stone Mercer, for the first time in 27 years, felt like he could finally breathe. Somewhere in the forest, a rusted truck still sat among the pines, but its message had been delivered, its purpose fulfilled. The silence had ended, and the signal so long ignored had finally been heard.